Our route was along the bayside, through Barnstable, Yarmouth, Dennis and Brewster to Orleans, with a range of low hills on our right running down the Cape. We noticed in Yarmouth every higher eminence had a pole set on it, with an old storm coat tied to it for a signal that those on the south side of the Cape, for instance, might know when the Boston packets had arrived on the north. The windmills on the hills, large weather-stained octagonal structures, and the salt works scattered along the shore with their long rows of vats resting on piles driven into the marsh, were novel and interesting objects to an inlander. I was struck by the pleasant quality which reigned among the stage company and their broad and invulnerable good humor. Some of them were first people, as they are called, retired sea captains in easy circumstances, an erect, respectable, and trustworthy-looking man in his wrapper, some of the salt of the earth, who had formerly been the salt of the sea, or a fisherman's wife who had been waiting a week for a coaster from Boston and had come out at length by the cars. Henry David Thoreau, 1864.
The town of Yarmouth rests on the biceps of the bent arm of Cape Cod. This land has been continuously inhabited since its creation by glaciers at the end of the last ice age. The first people called themselves the Wampanoag, the people of the first light. By the early 1600s, more than a dozen Wampanoag settlements were scattered along this peninsula. Among those inhabiting the Mid-Cape region were the Mattakeese, Cummaquid, Nobscusset, and Pauconicut tribes. When the first Europeans arrived here, the landscape was already dotted with cleared croplands and crisscrossed with paths well worn by 10,000 years of native settlement. Indeed, Yarmouth was a welcoming wilderness. The captain of the Mayflower thought the Pilgrims should settle here in 1620, but a blinding winter storm hid the entrance to the harbor and pushed them across the bay to Plymouth instead. Yet less than a generation after the founding of Plymouth Colony, a Mayflower passenger would become the first Englishman to build a dwelling in Mattakeese, Wampanoag for the old planting lands by the borders of the water, which would soon become known as the town of Yarmouth.
The house stood on the eastern declivity of the hill. It probably contained at first only one room, covered with hand-sawed planks, and the roof was thatch. The walls were not shingled on the outside or plastered on the in. Oiled paper supplied the place of glass. A cleat door with a wooden latch and string completed the fixtures of the house. Amos Otis, 1861.
Little more than a transitory camp, that simple one-room dwelling was built in Mattakeese in August 1638 by Pilgrim Stephen Hopkins. A year earlier, the Reverend Stephen Batchelor had marched several members of his congregation from Lynn to Mattakeese, hoping to establish a new settlement, but a harsh winter put a quick end to this enterprise. Thus, the Hopkins camp is considered the first English homestead here. It overlooked a tidal pond, swift stream, and acres of saltay to sustain his cattle. In the winter of 1639, 3 more Englishmen, Anthony Thatcher, John Crow, and Thomas Hawes, arrived to found a permanent settlement. More settlers soon joined them, bringing with them the family names that would become, and still are, the lifeblood of the town. Thus was founded the township of Yarmouth, one of the first 3 towns on Cape Cod. By 1640, there were 28 families scattered over Yarmouth's 8-mile square of territory, from the ancient stone-bounded Barnstable on the west to Quivik Creek, now in Dennis, on the east, and from Cape Cod Bay to Nantucket Sound. Most settled along the original Indian pathway, which ran from Barnstable by nearly the same course as Route 6A today. A few headed further south instead. In 1643, Yelverton Crow was the first to settle the area known as South Sea, striking a deal with the local sachem for a large parcel of land along Lewis Bay and Nantucket Sound. But the hub of the early town was on the north, where life for the first comers revolved around the meeting house, which served as church, town hall, and gathering place for the community. Sitting atop a slight sandy rise looking out over the scattered farms of the new town, the meeting house, later known as the First Congregational Church, was a simple wooden structure. It had no bell. Instead, Sunday services were announced by a beating drum. There was a wooden fort for protection, and next door, for sustenance and socializing, the town's first tavern. In the early days, there was virtually no separation between church and state. In Plymouth Colony, gathering a congregation was a prerequisite to establishing a town. In fact, in 1651, the Plymouth Court decreed, if any lazy, slothful, or profane persons in any towns neglect to attend public worship, they shall pay for each offense 10 shillings or be publicly whipped. If religion established the law for Old Yarmouth, farming ensured its livelihood. Field stone walls divided the grazing and planting lands of each family. Their homes were simple dwellings, traditional half-capes and salt boxes that were easily expanded as the family or its fortunes grew. They grazed cows and other livestock on the abundant salt hay and planted orchards of apples and pears, marching out towards the sea. Though it took years for the trees to bear good fruit, they were hardy and long-lived. This pear was planted by first-comer Anthony Thatcher, who is buried nearby. The surrounding farmland, site of Thatcher's 1639 homestead, are still tilled by his descendants. Corn was their mainstay crop, providing not only food but also valuable currency for everything from buying land to paying the minister. A busy mill ground corn for the settlers on the tidal pond near the original Hopkins camp. Built less than a century later, the Baxter Mill is still operational on the banks of Mill Creek in West Yarmouth. Though the Yarmouth settlers were successful farmers, they soon realized that the real abundance of their new town came not from its land, but from the sea. Herring and perch were plentiful in local ponds and streams. Shellfish crowded the tidal flats, and great catches of fish could be found offshore. Beach blackfish were a coveted gift from God, providing valuable oil and blubber. Yarmouth fishermen also pursued whales by boat and were, for a brief period, renowned for their expertise. Eventually, some of the profits from fishing were set aside for education. In 1693, Yarmouth hired its first headmaster, John Miller. Though later generations studied in district schoolhouses like this one in Yarmouthport, the first school sessions were taught on the squadron system. A single traveling teacher rotated through each part of town. Relations between Yarmouth and the local Native American population were mostly peaceful, even when King Philip's War broke out off Cape in 1675. In 1713, the town voted to set aside about 160 acres for the sole use of the local tribes. There was a meeting house for the 200 praying Indians converted to Christianity by local ministers. Neither peace nor prayers, though, were enough to sustain the native population of Yarmouth. By the end of the 18th century, they had been virtually wiped out by diseases like smallpox, to which they had no resistance. Their final resting place is marked by a cairn of boulders on the shores of Long Pond. June 20th, 1776. The inhabitants of the town of Yarmouth vote unanimously to declare a state of independence from the King of Great Britain, a full 2 weeks before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Such was Yarmouth's enthusiasm for the American Revolution. The town not only spent large sums to send food, blankets, stockings, and shirts for the colonial army, it also sent soldiers. Among the first were Captain Joshua Gray, commander of the local militia, and 81 volunteers who marched to Dorchester to help drive the British from Boston. The night before they left, the mothers and daughters of Yarmouth worked around the clock in the chamber of an old house here at the corner of Hallett and Wharf Streets, melting down family pewter to mold into ammunition, like this musket ball found at the site. As the American colonies achieved independence, so did a portion of Yarmouth. In 1793, by a unanimous vote, the town's eastern parish was given permission to incorporate as an independent town, to be named for its first minister, the Reverend Josiah Dennis. Bass River formed the new boundary between the two towns. A long spyglass is held in my eyes, pointing southerly, and I have my first glimpse of vessels at sea. Over a vast expanse of water, sails gleam snow-white as the waves of Nantucket Sound danced in the sunshine. Some of the older residents tell of counting 60, 125, and 160 vessels at one time off Bass River. Florence Baker, 1941. The early 1800s found Yarmouth well into its maritime heydays. A large fishing fleet was bringing home great catches of cod and mackerel, and bushels of salt needed to preserve the fish were produced all along the coast by evaporating seawater. To service an expanding merchant marine, Yarmouth was building sailing vessels, making rope to rig them, plying a brisk packet trade along the Atlantic seaboard, and captaining clippers to the four corners of the globe. By the 1830s, the windmills and drying vats of at least 9 salt works could be seen along the shores of Bass River. 6 more ringed the entrance to Great Island in West Yarmouth, and 18 edged the coastline on the town's northern shore. There were 2 rope-making businesses, or rope walks, one on the south side of town and one on the north. More than 200 years ago, the North Side Rope Walk's owner, Elisha Doane, was a wealthy businessman who ran a tavern on the Old Town Common at the head of the road to the harbor. Like many of his peers, Squire Doane, though not a seafaring man, had an interest in a diversity of maritime pursuits. His ledger of occupations included shipbuilder, storekeeper, fish broker, boat insurer, saltworks owner, moneylender, and importer of rum from the West Indies. When not tending bar, he was also Justice of the Peace and later, somewhat ironically, head of the Yarmouth temperance movement. Both coasts of Yarmouth had several wharves, bustling with activity. Here on any given day in the 1830s might be seen half a dozen sloops, schooners, brigs, and cutters loading or unloading stacks of lumber, bushels of salt, barrels of dried fish, and a miscellaneous assortment of boxes, bales, crates, and casks. Packets plied a regular route across the bay to Boston and from Bass River to New York and other ports to the south. The round trip to Boston cost about $1.25 and was far more comfortable than rattling overland by stage. Sailing times depended on the tides, so arrivals and departures were signaled by hoisting a flag on Yarmouth's highest hill. Historian Henry Kittredge has called Cape Cod the greatest nursery of seamen in North America, and Yarmouth was no exception. During the Great Age of Sail, Yarmouth was called home by more than 200 sea captains. Some of the more famous lived along a 2-mile stretch of the old King's Highway in Yarmouth Port. One of the earliest Yarmouth shipmasters, Captain Ebenezer Sears, is credited as the first American to sail a merchant vessel around Africa's Cape of Good Hope. In 1854, Captain Asa Eldridge aboard the clipper ship Red Jacket set the record for the fastest sailing time from New York to Liverpool, England. He made the journey in 13 days, 1 hour and 25 minutes, a record never broken by sail. Not long after, like many sons of Yarmouth's merchant marine, Eldridge was lost at sea to an unknown fate. Back home, the Yarmouth skippers were the pillars of the community, abiding in stately mansions filled with treasures from exotic ports. Captain Bangs Hallett, who sailed the Indochina trade in the 1840s and 50s, retired to this gracious Greek revival on the Common in Yarmouth Port. In the early 19th century, South Yarmouth was also coming into its own. David Kelly, a Quaker, purchased the last remaining Indian lands along Bass River in the 1790s. Within a few years, Indian Town was transformed into Friends Village. Simplicity was their religion. Since 1809, descendants of the Kellys, Aikens, Woods, Crowles, and Jenkins have gathered at this unassuming meeting house, men entering by one door, women by the other. They live like they buried their dead, without adornment. Their influence, however, was less humble. During the first half of the 1800s, the Quakers were the social and economic leaders of South Yarmouth, holding town office, heading the first banks, founding local businesses, establishing a school, running ferries and building bridges across Bass River. Thus, by the mid-1800s, Yarmouth had matured into a prosperous town with 3 distinct villages and a bustling local commerce. There was regular mail via packet and stage. An almshouse took care of the town's poor. A local newspaper, the Yarmouth Register and Barnstable County Advertiser, was founded in 1836. Townspeople and youth broadened their minds at village libraries, public and private schools, and a handful of civic and cultural organizations. In 1871, the town graduated its first high school class. It contained 4 students, all of them women. Lectures, plays, and other entertainments were presented at the village hall, which stood on the site of the present Lyceum Hall in Yarmouth Port. It was here at the junction of Route 6A and Summer Street, formerly Hall's Lane, that regional stagecoaches converged. The old Yarmouth Inn, built in 1690 and reputed to be the oldest on Cape Cod, sat at the end of the stage route from Boston and was the base for the stages to Hyannis, Chatham, and Provincetown. Nearby at the village pump, townspeople would stop to water their horses, draw household water, and catch up on news on their way to the shops. Perhaps to Knowles Market, which for many years was housed in this old building, now a bookstore. Or maybe to Hallett's drugstore for medicines, toiletries, tobacco, or stationery supplies. Down the street in this modest shop, built around 1800, could be found at various times a coffin maker, shoe store, post office, or the local newspaper. The variety of life and economy was matched by a growing diversity of churches. The Congregationalist Church was still vibrant, but by the end of the 1800s, many other strong faiths were represented. The Swedenborgians built this architectural gem on Route 6A in 1870. It remains unchanged to this day, from the Gothic architecture to the colorful frescoed walls to the old coal furnace, still the church's only source of heat. In South Yarmouth, Methodists began moving into Friends Village, gradually replacing the Quakers. They are well known for their summer tent revivals. The first Yarmouth camp meeting was held in August 1863. Small, ornate wooden cottages soon took the place of tents. Built in rings surrounding a central tabernacle, 70 of the old cottages still exist on the original campgrounds.
There is not much for me to say as to news in these parts. They are a scarce article. To hear people in the village talk, one would suppose it never was so dull before. Nothing is talked about but the going down of whaling, and many ships are laying up at wharves to spend the winter. Ships are scarce and masters plenty. Goodbye, 'tis time to mail this. Affectionately, John. To Captain Bangs Hallett from his son-in-law, October 17th, 1859.
The railroad, which first chugged into Yarmouth in 1854, is considered the greatest factor in the region's maritime decline. As Cape historian Henry Kittredge has commented, after the Civil War, New England was as busy driving spikes into railroad ties as it had been driving trunnels into the timbers of ships, and every spike was a nail in the coffin of the merchantman. In 1863, the Yarmouth Register reported that the last of the fishing fleet had been sold off, and in 1871 it carried the stark news, "There will be no Boston packet this year." Only one Yarmouth packet, the David K. Aiken, held on at Bass River until just after the turn of the century. By Yarmouth's Gala 250th anniversary celebration in 1889, the windmills of the last salt works along Bass River had ceased to turn, and most of the town's surviving sea captains were back on dry land, engaged in other trades. Intrepid Yarmouth entrepreneurs have since put their hand to eel farming, skunk trapping, fish freezing, and soda pop. But one of the more successful alternative industries proved to be an indigenous wild berry. In 1885, the Old Colony Cranberry Company attracted many local workers to its 36 acres of bogs near the South Yarmouth Railroad Depot. Founded the same year was the American Metallic Fabric Company, which manufactured wire belting used in making paper. Though now an abandoned building off North Main Street, the wire factory was in operation for some 90 years, its whistle sounding daily at noon and 5. But the biggest boon to the flagging economy was the summer visitor. The advent of modern infrastructure, the railroads, the canal, the motor car, electricity, and telephones, made Cape Cod more accessible to tourists. At first, all that Yarmouth lacked was a place for them to stay. The Register newspaper remarked in 1885, "There are a good many people in the cities who would like to come to Yarmouth and spend summer months but are deterred by the lack of hotel accommodations. If someone could be induced to meet this public want, our villages would be filled with visitors and a good deal of money would be put into circulation among our people, who will take the initiative in this beneficent enterprise." As it turned out, the whole town took part. Guest houses opened their doors throughout Yarmouth, and vacation homes lined the quiet roads along Bass River. One of the first grand summer resorts was the Inglewood Beach Hotel in West Yarmouth, which opened in 1901. The following summer, Aberdeen Hall was built overlooking Lewis Bay on Great Island. It had 45 rooms each with its own telephone, call bell, and electricity. Nearby was a golf course, a game park, and nature preserve. Property developers also wooed prospective buyers from off-Cape to new beachfront developments of summer homes. One of the earliest was Hyannis Park. Millionaire philanthropist Charles Henry Davis was one of Yarmouth's many prestigious summer residents. Co-founder of the National Highway Association, Davis built one of the first traffic rotaries in the United States at the intersection outside his summer estate in Bass River. His 36-room main residence, known as the House of Seven Chimneys, was described by House and Garden magazine in 1908 as probably the most unique house in America. Though maritime trade had faded, activity in Yarmouth still centered around the shoreline. If it wasn't summer folk crowding the beaches, it was rum runners smuggling liquor ashore during Prohibition. During World War II, spotting posts were set up along the coast of Yarmouth and other Cape towns to watch for enemy planes. Yet despite rationing and the requirements of the war effort, tourism continued to flourish. In fact, the local hotel association was told in 1942 that vacations were an absolute win-the-war necessity, for no one can perform his quadruple tasks without taking time out to build up war nerves and bodies. By the 1940s and 50s, Route 28, once a country road dotted with old farms and open spaces, was becoming crowded with cottage colonies, the forerunners of today's motels. Springing up between were filling stations, food stands, and small shops selling saltwater taffy and souvenirs. At the same time, though, the community was becoming increasingly involved in conservation, preservation, and zoning. The Historical Society of Old Yarmouth was officially established in 1953. 2 years later, Thatcher descendant Guido Pereira donated the Bangs Hallett House for the Society's headquarters, along with 49 acres of land, which became nature trails. In all, the Thatcher family has donated more than 240 acres to the town. Today, a large portion of the town is conservation land, held as a buffer to overdevelopment. Town-owned land includes Taylor Bray Farm, one of the oldest working farms in Barnstable County. The picturesque farm is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Another 1,000 acres are devoted to recreational pursuits. There are 15 saltwater and 5 freshwater beaches, several parks, numerous playing fields, 2 municipal golf courses, 14 public tennis courts, a playground, and a fishing pier. In recent years, retirees have added year-round numbers to the large summer population. Yarmouth is today a town that actively treasures its heritage. It is a lineage glimpsed in the gaze and fading faces of its ancestors. A legacy sheltered by the simplicity and graciousness of weathered dwellings. A history preserved in the hand-hewn planks of local landmarks. It is a vibrant past held aloft in the gnarled limbs and perennial blooms of an ancient pear tree, which first took root alongside Yarmouth nearly 4 centuries ago in 1639.